Well, we did it, at least sort of. Got a little bit of a green candle there going into the close. Nice little consolation, little lifeline, considering the harrowing gap down that we had after the Fed rally on Wednesday. But I think that the net change close to close was ever so slightly down. I didn't see it in the final seconds, but kind of a little neutral day. But at least looks like we might be finding some support here, so that's certainly good news. Hopefully going to kick things off to a better week next week. But this kind of leads me into one of my favorite topics in options trading and in finance, and that is about diversification. Now, before you go shutting off the channel and the show, I know everybody thinks, oh, I don't want to hear about diversification because that's kids' play. This is what we do when we don't know how to trade stocks. In fact, I've heard people call it diversification. Kind of clever, but still it's not right, because what they're saying is that if I have some winner stocks, but I ended up buying a whole basket, then those ones that are performing less are going to drag down my returns. So I might as well focus on the ones that I think are going to be the best. And if you think that way, it certainly sounds logical, but it's absolutely wrong. And that's what we're here to talk about in things like with trading tune-up. So today we're going to talk about the hidden benefits of diversification. And it's going to give us a little bit of a start for future classes, because I will show you, once you understand the basics of diversification, how it can be applied to some of the more esoteric concepts and things like with delta and with gamma and vega and different ways to diversify. But before you can appreciate that, you have to understand why we diversify in the first place and what it's all about. So let's go take a look at the hidden benefits of diversification. And what we're going to do is I'm going to use an example that was from economics back in the 1800s. It's kind of a clever example. And we're going to assume that we have $10,000 in gold. Unfortunately, our money is overseas. Now, that wouldn't be such a bad problem today, but in order to bring it back, we got to bring it back by ships. And so there's a 50% chance that your ship is going to get plundered by pirates, which means that we lose all of the gold. So financially speaking, the way that we should see this, we shouldn't say that we have $10,000 worth of gold, because there's only a 50% chance that we're ever going to get our hands on it. So what we do is we multiply these out. We say there's a 50% chance of the 10,000. We should really value that as 5,000. That's how we should see that financially speaking. So what would happen if we put $10,000 worth of gold onto one ship? What could we expect to happen? Well, we can kind of model this from a coin flip. We could say that 50-50 chance of a coin flip, right, coming up heads or tails. If the coin lands heads, let's say that that's success, that the ship arrives on shore safely, but if it's tails, we get plundered and we lose it. So if that's true, this is what our distribution would look like. We would see that half the time, okay, we got two bars. Notice that they both line up right here at 50%. But notice that in half the time, we get 0, and the other half, we get 10,000. We get the full amount. So one thing that's really interesting about this right off the bat is, even though our expected amount is 5,000, we can't even get that. It's impossible. And you've heard me talk about this for all the people in the webinars about extreme outcomes. As a general rule for trading, investing, you want to avoid extremes. Get rid of the tails. And what are we sitting with here? Nothing but tails. And how do we know that? Because we can't even get the $5,000 that is our mathematical expectation. We have no chance of getting it. It's all or none. It's either a really good day or a really bad day. So that's what I mean by extremes. When you are faced with this, from a trading perspective, there are going to be better alternatives. And one of the things you can turn to right off the bat is diversification. So what could we do here? Well, let's go load it up on two different ships. Let's split them up. Remember, we got $10,000 worth. We're going to put 5,000 onto one ship, 5,000 onto another ship. What can we expect to happen now? Well, we can go back to our two coins. We could flip a coin. Comes up heads, we're going to call it success on ship number one. Comes up tails, that would be a failure or a plunder on ship number one. But then we're going to flip a coin again. And if we get two heads, we could say that that is success for both ships. Both ships arrive on shore safely. We could get a head on the first coin and a tail on the second, which means the first ship arrives safely, second one gets plundered. We could get a tail on the first coin and a head on the second. This means the first ship gets plundered, but the second makes it back safely. And then finally, our worst case is that we get double tails, where both ships never come back. But notice there are four outcomes. We could get two heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, and tails, tails. There's only four things that can happen. So now if we graph these, that means there's a 25% chance for each of these, are all equally likely. Now look what we've done. See this middle one right here, it shares something. They both have heads, tails. So that actually comes up 50% of the time. So something really interesting is happening here. Now, 50% of the time, notice this red bar lines up at 50%. We can get our 5,000. That was our goal. And I got a 50% chance of getting that. When I sent one ship, I had 0%. Notice that we have a 25% chance of losing it all. I used to have a 50% chance. But also take a look over here. I still have some chance, not as good, but I have a 25% chance of getting the full 10,000. Now, again, this is where people who like to call it diversification say, see, I used to have a 50% chance of getting 10,000. Now I've got a 25% chance, and that completely misses the point. The point of diversification is not to roll the dice and take maximum risk to get the maximum gains. It is to get rid of these tails. So notice that we now have a 50% chance of getting 5,000. Before we had 0. But even more interesting, I now have a 75% chance to get at least 5,000. I still might be able to get 10,000. So now really, again, step back and think about that. With one ship, we had 0% chance of 5,000. Now, by just going for two ships, I have at least a 75% chance of getting that and only a 25% chance of losing it all. See, now we're starting to see these tails start to dissipate. All right, so that's only a 25% chance. What would happen if we sent 4 ships? Going to ramp up the diversification. So again, we got $10,000. We're going to put $2,500 onto each of 4 ships. What can we expect to happen now? We're going to do exactly the same thing. I'm not going to step through it, but we could go through 4 coins, and we would get this for a distribution. Now look what happens. Now to get at least 5,000, we have a 69% chance of getting at least that. We might do more. But see, now we might even get 7,500. We couldn't get that before. But now I have the ability to maybe get 7,500, and I still have an ability to get 10,000. But now look, the more important point is this. In order for me to lose everything is only a 6% chance. So again, you can see why people miss the point. They say, oh, but look, I don't have as good of a chance of maximizing my rewards. Absolutely correct. That misses the point of diversification. It's to get rid of these extremes. So we have to get something back. Okay, if we have a 6% chance of getting nothing, we've got a 94% chance that we get something. And something is always better than nothing. Couldn't do that with 2 ships. Let's bump it up to 8. We're going to put $1,250 onto each of 8 ships. What can we expect to happen now? Now look at this, starting to get more like our bell curve. So to get at least 5,000 is now 64%. But look at the 0. This is the key. 0.3% of losing it all, and that means we have a 99.7% chance to get something. This is the key of the diversification that everybody misses. It's not about maximizing, it's about getting rid of these tails. Now, to show you what happens if we work in the opposite direction, what if we amplify it? Okay, that was a diversification strategy. Let's look at what happens when people say, I don't want to do that. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. Let's say that we're going to play a game that requires 2 dice. Maybe it's whatever, Monopoly or some kind of a board game. We need 2 dice. And of course, the total numbers we could get, the total values would be 2 through 12. And if we do that, this would be our distribution. Again, we get a bell curve. We have some extremes out here into the tails. But notice that they're getting pushed lower. The extremes are starting to wash out. That's important. But watch what happens when we start correlating things. What we can do is, let's assume that we only had one die. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to tie these together. So let's say that we show up for our game, we don't have two dice, we've only got one die. And instead of rolling the single die twice, which would really be the appropriate thing to do, somebody comes up with the brainy idea to says, well, you know what? We're going to roll one die, and whatever's on the first die, we'll just make that the second. This is now perfect correlation. And so this is an extreme example of it. It's not quite what you're going to see in the markets, but this is exactly what's happening, more or less, when people say, I want to buy all chip stocks, or I want to buy all tech stocks. It's really what's called a naive diversification. It's like putting your eggs in separate baskets, but loading the baskets onto the same truck. All right, that one truck crashes and the whole thing collapses. So this is what happens when we start tying things together, which is mathematically called correlation. We're making them behave the same. And this, again, is what happens when people say, I just want to pick my favorite tech stocks. Be careful of that. What's going to happen now? We can only get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or 12. And look at this. Here's now our distribution. Let's compare them. What do you notice? When we have independence or diversification, we get rid of the tails. When we correlate things, we amplify the tails. This is exactly the opposite of what you want to be doing. And yet this is what so many people do by trying to go out and constantly pick their own stocks, or even other types of diversification strategies that they overlook. And all they're doing is amplifying the tail risk. And when we get in markets like this, that's when you're going to notice it. And unfortunately, by then it might be too late. So this is the key. The diversification is about getting rid of the tails. Correlation is about amplifying the tails. So what are some ways to diversify? Well, we all know that, buying the mutual funds in the S&P 500, that's a very basic way, but there's others. We can scale in and out of positions. I've talked about that many times in the webinars. You can write different expirations. You've heard John talk about that on the cocktail hour. John Najarian will talk about doing coverage, and he'll write a 1 week, 2 week, and a 3 week. And when the 1 week expires, he'll then write that as the new 3 week. And he just keeps them rolling. Okay, that's a very professional way to hedge or to diversify and to try to capture the average volatility. Right? So there's another diversification strategy. You might not have thought about it as a diversification strategy, but it is. What about covered calls? Anybody do covered calls out there? What about ratio writes? If you don't write any calls, you've got full-blown downside risk. If you write against your entire position, in other words, you've got 400 shares and you write 4 calls, it's another extreme. You've completely capped all of your shares. Well, what if you have 400 shares and you write 2 calls? That's what I'm talking about here. There are ways we can split the difference. We can sell half and roll half. Okay, I've talked about that before. We'll do other classes about that and different ways of managing risk by selling half and rolling half, and why that can get you into a guaranteed winning position much sooner than just trying to do straight up rolls. Why? Because of diversification. We can hold the risks and close the dangers. For those of you in Vegas, I talked about this, risks versus dangers. Risks are situations that we can get ourselves into. Obviously, we wouldn't put a position on with this, but they can end up being this. So let's say that we have a 5-point spread. We've got the 100-105 spread. Maximum it could be worth is 5, and let's say it's worth 490. That's what we call a danger. It can only go for us another 10 cents, big deal. But we've got $4.90 on the hook to the downside. It really can't help us, but it could certainly hurt us. Those are what we call dangers. What are some really interesting ways of closing the dangers but managing the risks that we want to hold? And I'll show you some of those with butterflies and condors and things, but they are all diversification strategies. That's what's at the heart of making them work. So I hope that gives you some things to think about, especially for people who often make things a lot more difficult by spending all their time trying to research the stock to pick the perfect stock when you might be better off just doing SPY. This is why you have to have a goal before you even figure out where you want to
invest and how you want to invest. You cannot even define risk without a goal, right? So think about that as well. And diversification could be an instant, one-stop way to solve a lot of problems at once. So